3 years ago, I had just turned 29 and was living alone in a small, quiet town. Life was simple. I worked a steady office job, had a couple of close friends, and enjoyed my solitude. Being on my own had never bothered me. In fact, I thrived on it. But after what happened, I started second-guessing every decision I'd made about living alone. It all began on a Friday evening. I remember it so clearly because I'd stopped at Walmart after work to pick up a few things for the weekend. The store was unusually busy for that time of day, but I didn't think much of it. I wandered the aisles with my small shopping cart, mentally ticking off the items on my list. Coffee, laundry detergent, some snacks. As I was standing in the cleaning supplies aisle, debating between two brands of fabric softener, a man approached me. He was maybe in his mid-30s, average height, wearing jeans and a slightly wrinkled shirt. He looked harmless enough. "Excuse me," he said, holding up a bottle of some multi-purpose cleaner. "Do you know if this stuff works well on grease? I just moved into a new place, and the stove's a mess." I glanced at the bottle and then at him. I think so. It says it's good for kitchen surfaces," I replied, giving a polite smile. "Thanks," he said, lingering for a moment. Then he added, "Moving is such a hassle. Have you ever had to clean a place from top to bottom?" I laughed nervously, not really wanting to engage, but feeling too polite to brush him off. "Yeah, it's not fun," he nodded, then asked, "So do you live around here?" That question set off a tiny alarm in my head. Why would he ask that? I shrugged, keeping my answer vague. "Kind of. Not too far." He smiled but didn't say anything more, and I quickly excused myself, pushing my cart to the next aisle. I figured that was the end of it, except it wasn't. As I moved through the store, I started noticing him in nearly every aisle I visited. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. After all, Walmart isn't small. But every time I stopped, he seemed to stop too, pretending to look at something nearby. I finished my shopping as quickly as I could and headed to the checkout line. When I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, a few registers down. He didn't have much in his cart, just the cleaner and a couple of random items. I paid for my things and hurried out to the parking lot, feeling relieved to be away from the fluorescent lights and crowded aisles. The sun was setting, and the lot was starting to empty out. I loaded my bags into my car and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of habit. As I started the engine, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and there he was, standing by his car, parked just a few spaces away, watching me. My stomach twisted. Was I overreacting? Maybe he just happened to park near me. Maybe I was imagining things. I pulled out of the lot and onto the main road, forcing myself to calm down. But a few minutes into the drive, I noticed a car behind me. It was a beat-up sedan, and it looked suspiciously like his. I made a turn onto a side street, not my usual route home, and the car followed. My heart was racing now. I took another turn, and so did he. I didn't want to lead him to my house, so I drove aimlessly for a while, making random turns, hoping he'd lose interest. Finally, I pulled into a gas station and parked near the entrance, where there were plenty of people around. I sat there for a few minutes, pretending to check my phone. When I looked up, the sedan was gone. I waited a little longer before heading home, still feeling uneasy. For the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the guy at Walmart wasn't following me. Maybe the car had just been going the same way. But late one night, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on the gravel in my backyard. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone. I didn't have the courage to look out the window, but I listened intently, straining to hear. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was outside my house. They assured me a patrol car was on its way and told me to stay inside with the doors locked. It felt like an eternity before the flashing red and blue lights finally lit up my driveway. I opened the door just enough to speak to the officers. They searched the yard but found nothing. No sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing disturbed. Still, I knew what I'd heard. For weeks after that, I was on edge. I started double-checking the locks every night, keeping the curtains drawn and making sure my porch light was on. The guy from Walmart never showed up again. Or if he did, I didn't notice. But that didn't make me feel any safer. It's scary how easily a random encounter can turn into something sinister. And even scarier how someone can disappear into the night, leaving you with nothing but questions and fear. It started innocuously enough. After the divorce was finalized, I thought that would be the end of it. For years I had been tethered to a man whose anger simmered just beneath the surface. But the papers gave me hope. Hope that I could finally breathe, rebuild, and move forward. But I underestimated him. I underestimated how deeply his need for control ran. The first sign came 3 weeks after the divorce. A text message lit up my phone late at night. "You'll regret this." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I blocked his number, but the unease lingered. Convinced myself it was an empty threat, the last gasp of a man who had lost his grip on me. I was wrong. At first, it was small things. I'd leave for work in the morning and find the side mirror on my car twisted at an odd angle. A package I was expecting never arrived. My trash cans were overturned. Each incident was minor, almost laughable on its own. But together, they painted a picture of someone trying to remind me that I was never truly alone. Then came the notes, slipped under my door, tucked into my mailbox, or left on the windshield of my car. They were short, cryptic, and chilling. "You can't hide from me. You'll always be mine. Watch your back." I reported it to the police, of course. They took my statement, nodded sympathetically, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But without direct proof, it was him. There wasn't much they could do. I changed my locks, installed cameras, and even bought a dog, a big, intimidating German Shepherd named Max. But none of it stopped him. The court hearings were the worst. He had contested the custody arrangement for our son, Jeremy, dragging me back into his orbit every few months. Each time he'd sit across from me in the courtroom, his gaze boring into me like a physical weight. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody, his mask slipped. His face twisted with rage as he hissed, "You'll pay for this. All of you will." That was the first time I truly felt fear. Not the vague unease that had been my companion for months, but cold, bone-deep terror. I filed for a restraining order the next day, but it felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a piece of paper. The escalation was swift and brutal. One night, I came home to find my living room window shattered. On the coffee table was a single Polaroid photograph of me and Jeremy, taken through the window of my own home. The message was clear. He was watching. I packed a bag and took Jeremy to stay with my sister for a few days. Her house was further out in the suburbs, surrounded by trees and far from prying eyes. For a while it felt safe, but then the phone calls started. They were always from blocked numbers, and he never spoke. Just the sound of his breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate. Sometimes he'd hang up after a few seconds. Other times, he'd stay on the line until I couldn't take it anymore, and hung up myself. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window set my heart racing. Max seemed on edge too, pacing the house and growling at shadows. My sister tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She started locking every door and window, even during the day. The breaking point came one night in early spring. I woke to Max barking furiously, his deep guttural growls echoing through the house. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept downstairs, my hands trembling. Max was at the back door, his teeth bared and his hackles raised. The motion-activated light outside had been triggered, and in its glow, I saw him. He was standing in the yard, just beyond the fence, his face obscured by the shadows. But I knew it was him. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the house. Then slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me through the glass. My blood turned to ice. I called the police, my voice shaking as I described what had happened. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They found footprints in the mud outside the fence, but nothing else. The officers were kind but resigned. Without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed up Jeremy and Max, and we moved into a small apartment across town. I didn't tell anyone the address, not even my closest friends. I changed my phone number, quit my job, and started over. It felt like cutting off pieces of my life to save what was left, but it worked. For a while, it worked. The silence was unnerving at first. No more notes, no more phone calls, no more shadows lurking just out of sight. I started to believe that maybe he had finally given up, that maybe I could rebuild the life he had tried so hard to destroy. But the fear never truly left me. Every time I walked to my car, I checked the back seat. Every time I heard footsteps behind me, my heart raced. Every time the phone rang, I hesitated before answering. He had taken so much from me, but the worst thing he stole was my sense of safety. It's been a year now since I last saw him. A year since that night in my sister's yard. I'd like to say I've moved on, but the truth is I'm still looking over my shoulder, because I know he's still out there, somewhere, and I know he's waiting. For what, I don't know, but I'll never stop being ready. A few years ago, I worked as a shift leader at a Taco Bell. I was 24, married with 2 small kids, and I lived just a few streets away from the store. I often walked to work to save on gas, so I spent most of my shifts on the floor, whether it was manning the registers or working the drive-thru. It started slowly. A man, a little older than me, began coming into the store. At first, it wasn't unusual. People came in all the time, but there was something about him. He was always polite, almost too friendly. He'd strike up conversations, laugh at my jokes, and make small talk. But it didn't take long before I started to notice that he came in only on the days I was working. At first, it didn't seem too odd. But then I started to realize he was there on every one of my shifts. If I was working the drive-thru, he'd come to the counter. If I was on the counter, he'd be there, asking me how my day was going. It was like clockwork. I tried to brush it off, tell myself I was overthinking things, but it felt like he was always watching me. I told my husband about it, mostly to vent, but I didn't think much of it. After all, it's not like I was doing anything wrong. But then one day, I showed up for my shift, and there he was, sitting in the back with one of the assistant managers being trained. My heart sank. I realized right then he wasn't just a customer anymore. It hit me like a punch in the stomach. He was trying to get put on my shifts. He had been following me, sitting at the same tables, talking to the same people, all just to make sure he'd be there when I was. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My hands were shaking, my stomach twisted in knots. I couldn't let this continue. Without thinking, I walked straight into the manager's office, my mind racing. The store manager was surprised to see me come in so frantic. She'd seen him around, sure, but she had no idea he was showing up only when I was there. When I told her what had been happening, she looked horrified. I could see it in her eyes. This was far beyond just an employee issue. She called the nearest Taco Bell and got him transferred to another store immediately. He was scheduled to work at ours for the rest of the day, but after that, he'd be gone. I could tell she was rattled, and honestly, I was too. I was shaken up enough that she let me go home early that day and called in the other night shift manager to cover. The next day, I came into work, hoping things would feel normal again. But when I walked in, she told me the man hadn't taken the news well. He'd argued, but in the end, he quit. I almost felt relieved, but there was still a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something didn't sit right. Then a few weeks later, he came back, just for a quick visit, like nothing had happened. It was as if he was testing the waters, making sure I wasn't still there. I could feel my nerves start to tingle. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was scared. So I had my husband come and sit in the dining room, just to make sure the guy didn't try anything. I wasn't sure what would happen if I saw him again. I was afraid he would keep showing up, lurking, trying to get closer to me. It worked. I didn't see him after that night. The restaurant felt a little safer, a little quieter without him lurking in the background. For a while, things went back to normal. But every now and then, when I think back to those days, I feel that same unease. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't caught on, if my manager hadn't intervened. It scares me to think about it, and part of me wonders if he's still out there, somewhere, still watching. It happened 2 years ago, but I still can't shake the unease. I've always been cautious about taking Ubers, but that night I had no choice. My car was in the shop, and I had stayed late at work. By the time I clocked out, the streets were quiet, and the buses had stopped running. I booked an Uber and waited outside under the dim streetlights. A dark blue sedan pulled up after a few minutes. The driver rolled down his window and smiled. He was a man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard. "Emma?" he asked. I nodded, got in, and gave him a polite smile. He didn't talk much at first, which I appreciated. After a couple of minutes, he broke the silence. "Long day?" "Yeah," I replied, glancing at my phone. He chuckled. "Must be tough working so late." There was something about the way he said it that made me feel exposed, as if he knew more about me than he should. I brushed it off and focused on the route displayed on my app. Halfway through, I realized we were heading down a side street I didn't recognize. "Hey, this isn't the normal way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a shortcut," he replied smoothly, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes lingered just a second too long. I didn't like it, but I told myself to relax. It wasn't unusual for drivers to take different routes. Still, I kept my phone in my hand, pretending to scroll while discreetly tracking our location. The shortcut led back to the main road soon enough, and he pulled up outside my apartment complex. "Have a good night," he said as I got out, his tone too friendly. "You too," I mumbled, rushing to the door. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. But over the next week, I noticed something strange. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw a dark blue sedan idling across the street. It looked like his car, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself I was just imagining things. 2 days later, I spotted a similar car parked near the grocery store while I was running errands. This time, I was almost certain it was him. My stomach turned as I quickly loaded my bags and drove home. Then, late one evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, saw you at the store earlier. You looked nice in that black coat." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone I'd gone shopping, and I was definitely wearing my black coat. I didn't respond, but the messages kept coming over the next few days. They were vague at first, compliments or casual remarks, but then they became more specific. "You're always so serious when you're walking to your building. You should smile more." He was watching me. I blocked the number, but that didn't help. A few nights later, as I was closing the blinds in my living room, I spotted a shadow in the alleyway behind my apartment. I froze, my hand on the cord, and squinted into the darkness. It was hard to see, but the outline of a man leaning against the wall was unmistakable. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, whoever it was had vanished. I led the officers to the alley, explaining what I had seen. One officer scanned the area with a flashlight, while the other questioned me. Just as I finished recounting the events, the first officer called out, "Over here!" We rushed to where he stood, near the wall where I had seen the figure. Beneath the faint glow of the street lamp, a pile of smoked cigarettes lay scattered on the ground. "Looks like someone's been here for a while," the officer said grimly, holding up a cigarette butt with gloved fingers. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. Each cigarette felt like a marker of time, proof that whoever had been there had been watching, waiting, and biding their time. That weekend, I went to stay with my sister in another town. The break gave me some peace of mind, but the fear lingered. When I returned home, I installed a security camera at my front door and another pointing toward the alley. For a while, nothing happened. No texts, no strange sightings. I even convinced myself that maybe he'd moved on. Then one night, as I was reviewing footage from the camera, I saw him. He wasn't close to the building, but there he was, standing across the street, staring at my window. He didn't move for what felt like hours before finally walking away. I moved out a month later, leaving behind the neighborhood I once loved. To this day, I don't know how he got my number or why he fixated on me. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, how it turned the most ordinary parts of my life into something terrifying. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. My name is Lily, and I've always prided myself on being cautious, aware of my surroundings. I work in marketing at a tech company, and for the most part, my job is as typical as it gets. Emails, meetings, presentations, the usual grind. But my previous employer, a small digital agency called Red Wave Media, was where everything began, where things turned. strange. Red Wave was a great place to start my career. It was a small team, which meant you got to know everyone, and everything felt personal. I made friends there and had a solid routine. That's where I met James, a new hire who'd been brought on for a mid-level position in IT. He was a quiet guy, always polite but reserved. He didn't stand out much, and I didn't think much of him at first. But soon, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. At first, it was innocent enough. Small talk during coffee breaks or when we'd run into each other by the printer. "How's the new project going?" He'd ask, or, "Did you get a chance to check out that article I sent?" He wasn't overly friendly, but I thought maybe he was just trying to be nice. Then, things started happening outside of work hours. I remember one Friday afternoon, I decided to head to a cafe near the office for a quiet cup of coffee. It was a place I went to every so often, but nothing too regular. I stood in line, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Fancy seeing you here," James said with a smile, clearly amused at the coincidence. I turned around, trying to mask my surprise. "Oh, hi. Didn't know you came here." "I don't usually," he said, stepping forward in line behind me. "Just thought I'd try it out today." I smiled politely, but the encounter stuck with me. It felt like more than just a random coincidence. How could he have known I came to this cafe? We'd never discussed it, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to chance. The next few days were uneventful until I noticed James was showing up a lot more at the office coffee machine. Whenever I'd stop by, he'd be there too, striking up casual conversation. "How's your day going?" Or, "Have you tried the new coffee blend?" Nothing alarming on its own, but the timing felt too perfect. It got stranger. One morning, after a particularly long meeting, I went to grab lunch at a nearby sandwich shop, one I visited often. As I walked out, I spotted a familiar face at the counter. "James? Again?" I muttered under my breath. He smiled at me. "What are the odds? I was just grabbing lunch, too." I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just coincidence. But the way he looked at me, too intently, like he was waiting for me to acknowledge him, felt wrong. I didn't say anything. Instead, I grabbed my sandwich and left. But it didn't stop there. Over the next week, I started seeing James in places I hadn't expected. Outside the building during my lunch break, in the parking lot after work. A few times, I'd spot him across the street while I was walking to my car, always standing in the same spot, watching. I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. It had to be coincidence, right? But then one night, I received a text from an unknown number. "Nice red dress today. You always look so good in it." My stomach dropped. I hadn't mentioned the dress to anyone. I checked the number, but it wasn't anyone I knew. I didn't reply, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that gnawed at me the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to take action. I spoke to my manager, explaining that I'd been feeling uncomfortable with James' attention. He assured me they would have a conversation with him. But the odd encounters kept happening. Then one evening, after working late, I was walking to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw James, a little too close for comfort. "Hey, you heading home?" he asked, his voice casual but with an edge I didn't like. "I'm fine, thanks," I said quickly, picking up my pace, but he kept walking beside me, not breaking his stride. "I thought we could grab a drink. Chat about work. I think you'd like that." I stopped walking and turned to face him. My heart raced. "No, James, I don't want to do that." He gave a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're always so serious. Lighten up, Lily. I just want to be friends." My stomach churned as I realized how trapped I felt. He wouldn't let go. "Please, just leave me alone," I said firmly, backing away toward my car. James stood there for a moment, his eyes following me, before he finally nodded and turned to leave. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I woke to another text from the unknown number. This time, it was a photo, taken from across the street, of me walking to my car. I couldn't breathe. I blocked the number immediately, but the unease never left. James had taken to texting me at odd hours, sending messages like, "You look nice today," or, "I see you're at your usual lunch spot." Things only escalated when I started seeing him outside my apartment building late at night, standing near the entrance like he was waiting for me. I took drastic measures. I changed my locks, stopped going to the usual places I frequented, and filed a report with HR and the police. The company moved James to a different department, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. I left Red Wave Media shortly after, too scared to stay in the same place. But to this day, I always feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm in the safety of my own home. The terror of someone you work with becoming obsessed with you lingers far longer than it should.